What if the system you swore to protect was built to destroy you? Deep inside the Atlanta PD, one undercover cop uncovers a web of corruption so deep it could take down the entire department. But when the hunters become the hunted, the truth comes at a deadly price. How far would you go to expose the system, when the system is coming for you? The city stretched out before Malcolm Reed as he drove past the flickering neon lights and rundown storefronts of Atlanta's South Side. He had spent years in places like this, streets where justice was often dictated by those in uniform. But not always in the way the law intended. The humid air clung to his skin as he rolled down his window, taking in the familiar scent of asphalt, fried food, and something faintly metallic that always seemed to linger in neighborhoods where struggle was a way of life. He was back. The police station loomed ahead, a gray slab of bureaucracy and control, standing in sharp contrast to the cracked sidewalks and battered row houses surrounding it. Malcolm had walked into many precincts before, but stepping into this one felt different. He wasn't here to enforce the law. He was here to expose those who twisted it. The moment he entered, he felt it, a shift in the air. Conversations quieted just enough for him to notice. A few officers threw passing glances his way, their expressions unreadable, but the weight of their stares settled on him like a lead vest. This wasn't a warm welcome. Not that he had expected one. At the front desk, an older officer sat hunched over paperwork, chewing absently on a toothpick. His uniform was worn, the badge dulled at the edges. When he finally looked up, his gaze settled on Malcolm, studying him in a way that suggested he'd seen too many men come through those doors. And not all of them had made it out in one piece. "You the transfer from Miami?" the officer asked, his voice scratchy like someone who had spent a lifetime yelling over sirens. Malcolm nodded. The officer let out a slow breath and leaned back in his chair. "If you're smart, you'll keep your head down. This place has its own way of doing things. Best not to ask too many questions if you want to make it past probation." Malcolm met his gaze but said nothing. A clipboard was shoved across the counter, along with a set of keys. Lockers in the back. "Watch yourself. Read." The station itself was a maze of peeling paint, flickering fluorescent lights, and desks cluttered with coffee-stained reports. The atmosphere was heavy, filled with the low hum of ringing phones and the occasional burst of laughter that never quite reached the eyes of the men exchanging it. As Malcolm passed through the main bullpen, he caught sight of a man watching him from across the room. Lieutenant Frank Dolan, broad-shouldered, with a presence that commanded attention without saying a word. His uniform was pressed, his boots polished, and the way he carried himself made it clear. This was his kingdom. Malcolm had read Dolan's file before arriving. Decorated officer, respected by many, feared by more, the kind of cop who had been around long enough to know where every skeleton was buried, and had probably helped bury a few himself. Their eyes met. Dolan's expression didn't change, but there was something there. A flicker of recognition, maybe, or suspicion. Malcolm held the gaze just long enough to make it clear he wasn't intimidated. Then he moved on. In the locker room, he found his assigned space and began unpacking his gear. A few feet away, another officer, older with graying hair and a tired look, closed his locker with a sigh. "You must be the new guy," the man said. Malcolm nodded. The officer glanced toward the door, as if making sure they were alone, then lowered his voice. "This place ain't like the others. You got a good record. Maybe you're here to do the job right. That's fine. But if you want to make it out of here in one piece, remember this. Some things are better left alone." The warning lingered between them before the man grabbed his coat and walked out. Malcolm exhaled slowly. This was exactly why he was here. Later that night, as he drove home, he noticed it. A car, dark, no plates. It had appeared behind him twice already. He changed lanes. The car did the same. He turned a corner. It followed. Malcolm kept his hands steady on the wheel, his mind racing through possibilities. Someone was watching, and whoever it was, they wanted him to know. Malcolm woke up to the sound of rain tapping against the window. The gray morning sky stretched over Atlanta like a worn-out sheet, dull and uninviting. He had barely slept, his mind still tangled in the events of the previous night. The car without plates, the way it shadowed him, the silent message it carried. Someone was already watching. He stepped into his kitchen, poured himself a cup of coffee, and stared out at the quiet neighborhood. It wasn't much, just a modest rental on the outskirts of the city. The kind of place that didn't draw attention, where people minded their own business. He had chosen it for that exact reason. But last night had made one thing clear: keeping a low profile wouldn't be easy. By the time he arrived at the station, the air inside felt heavier than usual. Officers moved about in their routine, but there was an unspoken rhythm Malcolm was starting to notice. Small glances exchanged, conversations cut short when he walked past. It was like stepping into a room where everyone knew a secret except him. A voice called out from across the bullpen. "Reed, Lieutenant Dolan wants to see you." Malcolm turned toward the source, one of the desk officers. A guy who had barely acknowledged him before. Now, his tone was clipped, almost rehearsed. The request didn't surprise him. If Dolan was already sizing him up, it meant the real test was beginning. Dolan's office was tucked away in the back of the station, its door slightly ajar. Inside, the lieutenant sat behind a heavy wooden desk, flipping through a file with deliberate slowness. He didn't look up when Malcolm stepped in. "Close the door." Malcolm did as he was told. The office smelled faintly of old leather and coffee. But beneath that, there was something else: gun oil. The lingering scent of a man who carried power like a second skin. Dolan finally looked up. "You got an interesting record." Malcolm stayed silent. Dolan leaned back, tapping the file with his index finger. "Miami, huh? Worked undercover. Saw some nasty stuff, I imagine." It had its moments. Dolan smirked. "And now you're here. Transferred in. No questions asked. That's rare. Real rare." Malcolm held his gaze, knowing exactly what Dolan was doing. This wasn't small talk. It was a dissection. "I go where the job takes me." Dolan nodded slowly, then closed the file. "That so? Well, we do things a little differently here. You want to keep up. You follow the lead. No cowboy moves. No questions." Malcolm didn't blink. "Understood." Dolan watched him for another long moment, then pushed his chair back. "Good. Let's go." Malcolm followed him out of the office, down the station hall, and into the humid air outside. Parked at the curb was a patrol car with a younger officer standing beside it, adjusting his belt. "This here's Carter," Dolan said, gesturing toward the man. "He'll be showing you the ropes today. Keep your eyes open." Carter was a little younger than Malcolm had expected. Late 30s, with a sharp jawline and a look that carried a hint of amusement. Like the whole world was some inside joke only he understood. "Hop in," Carter said, nodding toward the passenger seat. Malcolm slid in, glancing at the dashboard. The car smelled like cheap cologne and fast food, with the distinct undertone of cigarette smoke that had settled deep into the seats. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the city passing by in a blur of old brick buildings and fast food joints. Then, without warning, Carter pulled into a side street and slowed the car to a crawl. "See that guy?" Carter nodded toward a black man standing near a corner store, checking his phone. Malcolm felt his jaw tighten. "What about him?" Carter shrugged. "Looks suspicious." Malcolm didn't respond. Carter switched on the patrol lights. "Let's say hello." As they pulled up, the man looked up, confusion flashing across his face. He was in his early 40s. Dressed in a button-down and slacks, hardly the image of a threat. Carter stepped out first. "Hands where I can see him." The man's brows furrowed. "What? I didn't." "Hands." Carter's tone hardened. Malcolm followed suit, stepping out but keeping a few feet back, watching. The man slowly raised his hands. "I was just waiting for my ride." Carter gave him a once-over. "Waiting for a ride, huh? You got ID?" The man pulled out his wallet carefully. His movements slow, deliberate. He handed over his driver's license. Carter took it, turning it over in his fingers like he was looking for something wrong with it. "Step away from the wall," Carter ordered. The man hesitated, glancing at Malcolm for the first time. There was a silent question in his eyes. Malcolm took a slow breath. He had seen this before, knew how it played out. He had spent years working cases, blending into the criminal world, seeing how power was abused from both sides. And right now, he could feel it, the weight of a choice pressing against him. Carter turned to Malcolm. "Go ahead, pat him down." Malcolm didn't move. Instead, he looked at Carter. For what? Carter's smirk twitched. Just do it. Malcolm held his ground. We got probable cause? Carter stared at him, and for the first time, that amused glint in his eyes faded. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Then, before Carter could respond, a voice cut through the air. Hey. They both turned. Across the street, a woman was holding up her phone. Recording. She was young, early 20s maybe, with braids pulled back into a ponytail and an expression that made it clear she had seen enough of these encounters before. Everything good over there? She called out, her camera still aimed at them. Carter's jaw tightened. He took one last look at the man, then turned back to Malcolm. Guess he's clean, Carter muttered, tossing the ID back. The man exhaled sharply, rubbing his wrist as he took a step back. Am I free to go? Carter didn't answer. He was already turning toward the car. Malcolm watched as the man walked away, his shoulders still tense, the imprint of the moment lingering in his expression. As they got back into the patrol car, Carter let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. That's cute, he said, his voice laced with something that wasn't quite humor. You think you're different? Malcolm didn't reply. Carter leaned back, smirking again, but there was something sharper in his tone now. Dolan's gonna love you. The streets of Atlanta had a way of changing after dark. The daytime heat clung to the asphalt, mixing with the scent of exhaust and fried food from late-night vendors. Neon signs flickered, casting jittery reflections in puddles along the cracked sidewalks. In neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce, desperation moved like a silent current beneath everything. Malcolm sat in the passenger seat of the patrol car, watching the city roll past. Beside him, Blake Carter had one hand draped over the wheel, the other resting lazily on the door. The hum of the police radio filled the silence between them. It had been like that for most of their shift. Carter wasn't much for small talk. You ever do nights back in Miami? Carter finally asked, keeping his eyes on the road. Sometimes, Malcolm replied. Carter smirked. Yeah, bet you saw some real nasty stuff down there. Malcolm didn't take the bait. He had spent years working cases that most people wouldn't want to think about. But he wasn't about to swap war stories with a man like Carter. The radio crackled, and Carter reached for the receiver. A call came through. Disturbance reported near a rundown apartment complex on the south side. That's us, Carter said, making a sharp turn. The complex was exactly what Malcolm expected. Concrete stairwells stained with graffiti, busted-out windows covered with cardboard, and a group of young men standing in a loose circle near the parking lot. Carter parked and stepped out with an air of ownership, his boots crunching against loose gravel. Let's see what's going on. The young men stiffened as the officers approached. They weren't doing anything, just talking, sharing a few cigarettes, but Malcolm could already see where this was headed. Carter didn't bother asking questions. Hands where I can see him. One of the guys frowned. For what? Carter ignored the question, nodding toward Malcolm. Search him. Malcolm hesitated. These kids weren't a threat. No signs of weapons. No sudden movements. Just a group trying to stay out of trouble in a city that didn't give them many chances. Carter glanced at him. I said, search him. Malcolm stayed still. The air thickened between them. Then Carter stepped closer, lowering his voice. Listen, hero, you're on my shift. You do as I say, or I tell Dolan you're not a team player. Malcolm clenched his jaw. He could see it now. The game being played. This wasn't about the kids. This was about testing him, pushing him to see where his limits were. Before he could respond, one of the young men took a step back, not running, just shifting his weight, but it was all Carter needed. Hey, Carter grabbed him by the collar, shoving him against the hood of the patrol car. Where you going? The kid flinched. Nowhere, man. Carter pressed down harder. Oh, now you want to cooperate? That's funny. Malcolm moved between them, his voice even. Carter, that's enough. Carter turned slowly. You got a problem, Reed? Yeah, Malcolm said. We got no cause to do this. A beat of silence. The other young men stood frozen, unsure if stepping in would make things worse. Carter studied Malcolm for a second, then let go of the kid with a hard shove. Fine, they get a pass tonight. He turned back to the patrol car. Get in. Malcolm stayed where he was a moment longer. watching the kids as they slowly relaxed. One of them met his gaze, confusion flickering behind his eyes. Not all cops did what Carter did, but they'd seen it enough to know which ones would. Malcolm got in the car. Carter pulled away from the curb, his hands gripping the wheel tighter than before. "You think you're different?" Carter finally asked, his voice calm but edged with something sharper. Malcolm said nothing. Carter let out a short laugh. "You got no idea what this place is, do you?" The rest of the drive was silent. When their shift ended, Carter didn't take Malcolm back to the station. Instead, he pulled into a gravel lot outside a dimly lit bar with a rusted sign above the door. "The Rusted Iron. This is where we unwind," Carter said. "Let's grab a drink." Malcolm knew what this was. An invitation, but not the kind you could refuse without raising suspicion. He stepped inside. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the low murmur of conversation. The patrons weren't just cops, there were others. Men who carried themselves with the confidence of knowing they had friends in the right places. Malcolm followed Carter to the bar, his eyes scanning the room. In the far corner, a group of officers stood huddled around a man in a dark suit. He wasn't a cop. The way he sat, relaxed but in control, told Malcolm everything he needed to know. Money changed hands. A small exchange. Quiet. Almost unnoticeable. But Malcolm saw it. Carter clapped him on the shoulder. "See? We're not so bad once you get to know us." Malcolm forced a smirk, lifting his drink. As the night dragged on, conversations blurred together, the room filling with laughter and the occasional burst of applause from a pool game in the back. Malcolm kept his movements casual, but his mind was working through every detail. Then, as he turned to head for the door, someone brushed past him, a slip of paper pressed into his hand. He didn't react, just tucked it into his pocket and walked outside. Once he reached his car, he unfolded the note. It was short. "Be careful, you're being watched." Malcolm sat at his desk in the precinct, staring at the computer screen as the cursor blinked in front of him. He had been searching through case files for nearly an hour, looking for patterns. Arrests that Dolan had been involved in, reports that had gone missing, complaints that had mysteriously been dropped. But every time he thought he had found something, the trail went cold. Documents were missing, timestamps didn't add up, and in some cases, entire reports had been wiped from the system as if they had never existed. He wasn't surprised. If Dolan had been running things his way for years, there was no doubt he had people covering his tracks. What Malcolm needed was something they hadn't scrubbed. A mistake, a loose thread, but finding it wouldn't be easy. A chair scraped against the floor behind him. He turned to see Lieutenant Hayes, one of the senior officers who handled administrative oversight. He was a man who had mastered the art of looking busy while doing absolutely nothing. "Reed, what exactly are you looking for?" Hayes asked, his voice casual but his eyes sharp. Malcolm kept his expression neutral, following up on some reports. Noticed some discrepancies in case filings. Hayes gave a tight smile. "Yeah, that happens sometimes. Bureaucracy, clerical errors, nothing unusual. Seems to happen a lot in cases Dolan handled." The smile didn't waver, but the air in the room shifted. "I'd be careful about chasing ghosts. Reed, you're new here. Best to focus on the job in front of you and not get caught up in the past." Malcolm studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Understood." Hayes lingered just a second longer before walking away, but his meaning was clear. "Back off." Malcolm logged out of the system and stood up. He wasn't about to stop digging, but he needed to be smarter about it. That thought barely settled before he saw Carter approaching. "Reed," Carter said, slapping a stack of papers onto his desk. "Guess what? You're on report duty now. Seems like somebody filed a complaint about you. Said you were acting aggressive on a call last night." Malcolm didn't need to ask who had filed it. This was how the game was played. They weren't going to come at him head on. They'd chip away, one small move at a time, trying to push him into a corner. "Must be a mistake," Malcolm said, keeping his voice even. Carter smirked. "Sure it is. Don't worry. I let Dolan know you'd be more careful next time." Malcolm said nothing. He just took the paperwork and walked away. By the time his shift ended, he was drained, not physically, but mentally. The weight of knowing they were closing in, testing his patience, waiting for him to slip. made it hard to think straight. He needed space, needed air. He drove home through the dimly lit streets, keeping an eye on his mirrors. Something in his gut told him he wasn't alone. A few blocks from his apartment, he spotted it, a dark sedan, 2 cars behind him. It had been there too long. When he turned, it turned. When he slowed, it kept its distance but didn't break away. Not tonight, he thought. Malcolm took an abrupt right onto a side street, then a left down a narrower road. The car followed. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He needed to be sure. Instead of heading straight home, he made another series of turns, weaving through residential streets, moving farther from familiar areas. The car stayed with him. Now he knew. He turned onto a one-way alley, his headlights bouncing off damp brick walls. The street was empty, quiet except for the steady hum of his engine. Ahead, the alley opened up to another main road, but before he could reach it, the dark sedan sped up behind him, cutting off his exit. His heart pounded. He braced himself. The driver's side door of the sedan opened, and a man stepped out. Then another, and another. 3 men, no uniforms, but he didn't need them to tell him who they were. Cops moved differently. The way they stood, the way they carried their weight, the way their hands never strayed too far from their belts. It was second nature. One of them, a stocky man with close-cropped hair, took a step forward, cracking his knuckles. "You want to play big, Reed?" he said, his voice calm but edged with something dangerous. "Let's see how long you last." Malcolm kept his breathing steady as the men moved in. The alley was tight, brick walls on either side, a few dumpsters lining the edges. There was no easy way out. The 3 officers stood between him and the only exit, their postures loose but intentional. He recognized Carter immediately. The man stood slightly ahead of the others, the same smug confidence in his stance as always. "You've been busy, Reed," Carter said, rolling his shoulders like he was warming up for a fight. "Digging into things you shouldn't." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "I just do my job." Carter let out a short laugh. "That's cute, real cute. See, the thing is, we don't like guys like you. The ones who come in thinking they're gonna clean house, set things straight." He shook his head. "This city's been running just fine without you." One of the other officers, a thick-set man with a shaved head, took a step closer. "You think you're smart, but you're not. You don't understand how things work here." Malcolm didn't move. His pulse was steady, but his mind was already calculating options. The alley was too narrow for a full sprint. He could fight, but that would play into exactly what they wanted. A charge of resisting arrest. Maybe even assaulting an officer. Carter seemed to read his thoughts. "I know what you're thinking. If you hit back, we take you in for obstruction. If you don't, well," he smirked, "you're still gonna hurt by the time we're done here." Malcolm didn't take the bait. Instead, he looked at Carter, his voice even. "You sure this is how you want to do this?" Carter's smirk twitched. A flicker of something crossed his face. Annoyance. Maybe. Then, without warning, the thick-set officer threw the first punch. It came fast, aimed at Malcolm's ribs, but he was ready. He twisted just enough to absorb the impact, shifting his weight to avoid stumbling. Another punch came, this one wilder, sloppier. Malcolm blocked, his muscles coiled, but he still didn't strike back. "Come on," Carter taunted. "What's the matter? Not so tough now?" A second officer moved in, aiming a blow toward Malcolm's stomach. He turned just in time, letting the momentum throw the man slightly off balance. That was when he saw it. A flicker of movement at the far end of the alley. Headlights. A car turned sharply into the alley, its high beams slicing through the darkness, casting long shadows against the walls. The sudden glare froze everyone in place. Carter squinted, shielding his eyes. Malcolm took a step back, using the distraction to reset his stance. The driver's door of the car opened, and a figure stepped out. Malcolm's breath slowed when he recognized the man. Ethan Hayes. The younger officer stood just outside the car, his expression unreadable. The tension in the alley shifted, uncertainty creeping in. Carter turned, his smirk faltering for the first time. "What the hell are you doing here, Hayes?" Ethan's gaze flickered between Malcolm and the officers. His hand rested near his belt, close enough to his holster that it made Carter hesitate. Malcolm watched him carefully, searching for a sign. Was Ethan here to help? Or was he just another part of the game? Malcolm sat in a quiet corner of a coffee shop a few blocks from the station. His back to the wall, eyes scanning the room. The place was small, just a handful of booths and a worn-out counter where an old radio played soft blues. A few customers sat hunched over their cups, lost in their own worlds. It was the kind of spot where conversations went unnoticed, drowned out by the hum of the espresso machine and the occasional rattle of spoons against ceramic mugs. Ethan walked in, his movements stiff, his eyes darting toward the windows before settling on Malcolm. He hesitated for half a second, then made his way over, sliding into the seat across from him. Neither of them spoke at first. The tension between them was thick, layered with unspoken questions. "You drink coffee?" Malcolm asked, keeping his voice casual. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Not tonight." Malcolm leaned forward. "Then why are you here?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the door before lowering his voice. "I shouldn't be. But you are." Malcolm pressed. "That means something." Ethan looked down, his fingers drumming against the tabletop. "You don't get it, man. This place, these people, they don't forget. You cross them, you don't just lose your badge. You lose everything." Malcolm's stare didn't waver. "Then why did you stop Carter?" Ethan let out a hollow chuckle. "Because I'm not completely gone yet. But that doesn't mean I'm stupid." Malcolm could see the conflict in him. The fear, the weight of knowing too much but not having the courage to act on it. He had seen it before, in witnesses, in informants, in good people who had let the system turn them into cowards. "You don't have to pick a side," Malcolm said, leaning in just enough to close the distance. "You just have to tell me the truth." Ethan swallowed hard, his fingers curled into a fist, then loosened. Finally, he spoke. "Check the case logs," he muttered. "The ones from the last 3 years. Look for cases where evidence went missing. Reports got corrected. It's all there. You just have to know where to look." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "And Dolan?" Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. "You don't get to Dolan. You don't touch him unless you want a bullet in your back." He exhaled, pushing himself up from the table. "I'm done talking, but if you're smart, you'll get out before it's too late." Malcolm watched him go, his mind already racing through the possibilities. He had what he needed. Now he just had to find the proof. That night, Malcolm waited until the station had settled into its usual late-night rhythm. Most of the higher-ups were gone. The bullpen was quieter, and the only officers still around were too tired or too distracted to pay much attention. He moved with purpose, walking past the main offices and toward the records room, his ID badge clipped to his belt like he belonged there. The key was to act natural. Suspicion only came when you looked like you didn't belong. He reached the door and swiped his badge. The lock released with a soft click. Inside, rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, the glow from the computer monitors casting long shadows. He sat at one of the terminals, typing in search queries, filtering through years of closed cases. And then he saw it. A pattern. Dozens of cases, spanning 3 years, all with similar red flags. Drug busts where cash went unaccounted for. Weapons that had been logged into evidence but never made it to court. Arrests where key witness testimonies had mysteriously disappeared. And at the center of nearly all of them, Dolan's name. The deeper he looked, the worse it got. This wasn't just 1 or 2 bad calls. It was a system, a machine designed to make cases disappear when it suited the right people. His pulse quickened. He copied the files onto a flash drive, ejecting it just as a noise from the hallway made him freeze. A door shutting. Footsteps. He killed the screen, stuffing the drive into his pocket. Nothing. For a long second, he didn't move. Then, when he was sure the hallway was clear, he slipped out the way he had come, keeping his head down until he was back outside. The night air felt colder than before. As he approached his car, he stopped dead. His windshield was shattered, cracks spider webbing across the glass. A single brick sat on the hood. He stepped closer. Taped to the brick was a piece of paper. The words scrawled in black ink. "You have 48 hours." Malcolm sat in his car, parked beneath a dying street lamp on the outskirts of the city. The night had settled in, thick and heavy. The kind that swallowed sound and made every movement feel sharper. In his pocket, the flash drive he had stolen from the precinct felt heavier than it should have. He had spent hours combing through the files, connecting the missing pieces, and now he had a name. James Holloway. The name had popped up in several of the erased cases. A former internal affairs investigator, Holloway had been in the middle of a deep corruption probe before he abruptly resigned 2 years ago. No public statements, no follow-ups, just gone. That alone told Malcolm everything he needed to know. The address he had found wasn't a house, not even an apartment, just an abandoned warehouse on the edge of an industrial lot, where the city faded into rusted-out factories and forgotten roads. A place where people went when they wanted to disappear. Malcolm killed the engine and stepped out, his boots crunching against loose gravel. The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking structure with broken windows and faded graffiti along its walls. A single flickering light shined above a metal door, casting long, jittery shadows. He knocked twice. Silence. Then, a shuffling noise. Something metallic scraped against the other side of the door. "Go away," a voice rasped. Malcolm didn't move. "James Holloway?" The door stayed shut. "I know who you are," Malcolm continued. "I know why you left. And I know who made you disappear." A long pause. Then, the door cracked open, just wide enough for Malcolm to see a bloodshot eye staring at him. "You're either real stupid or real desperate," Holloway muttered. Malcolm didn't blink. A little of both. Another pause. Then, with a sigh, Holloway stepped back and let him in. The place was barely livable. An old cot was pushed against one wall, surrounded by empty beer bottles and newspapers yellowed with age. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, its glow barely reaching the corners of the room. A rusty filing cabinet sat in the corner, drawers half open, stuffed with papers that looked untouched for years. Holloway looked worse than the room. His hair was wild, his face covered in days-old stubble. He moved like a man whose body had started giving up on him. But there was something in his eyes, something that hadn't burned out yet. Malcolm got straight to the point. "I need information on Dolan. You were investigating him before you disappeared." Holloway let out a dry chuckle. "Investigating? That's a nice way to put it. You had something on him." "Had," Holloway said, past tense. He sank into a rickety chair, rubbing his temples. "I had everything. Testimonies, bank records, surveillance footage, enough to put him away for life." Malcolm narrowed his eyes. "So what happened?" Holloway let out a slow breath. "They happened." Malcolm waited. "I was getting close," Holloway continued. "Too close. The higher-ups knew it. One day, I get called into a meeting. Not in the precinct, not official, just me and a couple of guys I'd never seen before. Dressed sharp, acting polite. They tell me I'm making a mistake. That maybe I misfiled some reports. That maybe I need to take some personal time." Malcolm clenched his jaw. "And when you didn't?" Holloway's lips curled into a bitter smile. 2 days later, someone leaked a report that I had been taking bribes. False evidence, but damning enough to stick. My name was trashed, my pension gone, my career over." He shook his head. "I was going to fight it. But then they made sure I got the message." Malcolm felt a chill creep up his spine. "What did they do?" Holloway's voice dropped. "They put a bullet through my front window, just above my kid's crib." The words hung between them. Malcolm exhaled slowly. "So you ran." "I disappeared." Holloway's gaze darkened. "And if you're smart, you'll do the same. Because if you keep digging, they'll do to you what they did to me. Or worse." Malcolm reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. "I need to record this. If I can get your statement." Holloway raised a hand. "Don't bother. Nobody's gonna listen. The people that matter already know. And the ones who don't? They won't care." Malcolm hesitated, then pressed record anyway. "Tell me everything you remember." For the next 20 minutes, Holloway talked. He detailed the cases, the money trails, the officers involved, names, dates, locations. Malcolm soaked it all in, committing it to memory even as he recorded. When it was over, Holloway sat back, rubbing his face. "That's all I got. Take it and leave. And don't come back." Malcolm nodded, slipping the phone into his pocket. As he stepped out into the night, the cold air hit him like a warning. This was bigger than he had thought. He drove home in silence, the weight of the conversation settling deep in his bones. When he pulled into his complex, something felt off. The lights in his apartment were on. He was sure he had turned them off before leaving. His stomach tightened. He climbed the stairs slowly, his fingers brushing against the grip of his gun. The door was shut, but when he pressed his palm against it, it gave way too easily. Unlocked. Inside, his apartment was wrecked. Drawers pulled out, papers scattered across the floor. The cushions on his couch slashed open. Everything he had collected, gone. A cold rage settled in his chest. They had been here, and they weren't hiding it. They wanted him to know. The night air in Atlanta was thick, clinging to Malcolm's skin as he pulled into the underground parking lot. His fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel, his mind working through every possibility. This meeting was a risk, but it was the only way forward. His contact, a journalist named Lisa Harper, had been one of the few investigative reporters still willing to dig into police corruption. Malcolm had reached out after confirming she wasn't on Dolan's payroll, but that didn't mean she was safe. He parked near the back, where the overhead lights flickered weakly, leaving most of the lot bathed in shadows. Lisa was already there, leaning against the hood of a dark sedan, her expression tight. "You sure this is safe?" she asked as he stepped out. "Nothing about this is safe," Malcolm replied, "but I don't have time for careful." Lisa exhaled sharply and pulled a small recorder from her pocket. "Tell me everything." Malcolm didn't hesitate. He laid it out. The erased evidence, the missing case files, Holloway's testimony, and how Dolan's network stretched far beyond what anyone had publicly exposed. Lisa listened, her face unreadable, but he could see her brain processing every word, piecing together a story bigger than even she had expected. "You have proof?" she asked. Malcolm pulled a flash drive from his pocket. "Everything I could copy before they wiped the rest. It's not enough to bring him down, but it's enough to start a war." Lisa reached for it, but before her fingers could close around the drive, Malcolm caught movement in his peripheral vision. A car, parked a few rows away, engine running. They weren't alone. He tensed, keeping his voice low. "We need to wrap this up now." Lisa must have seen the shift in his expression because she stiffened. Then, as if on cue, her phone rang. She hesitated before answering. "Harper." A pause. Then her face paled. Without another word, she shut off the call and shoved the phone into her bag. "We're burned." Malcolm didn't ask how she knew. He could already hear it. The faint but distinct sound of approaching footsteps. Lisa stuffed the recorder into her coat. "I have to go. If they see me with you, I lose my credibility." She turned, walking briskly toward the exit, disappearing into the night. Malcolm stayed still, heart pounding. Then came the shout. "Hands where I can see them." The parking lot flooded with red and blue lights. He turned, already knowing what he'd see. Uniformed officers moving in, weapons drawn, their movements too precise for this to be anything but premeditated. One of them stepped forward, a sneer curling his lips. "Malcolm Reed, you're under arrest." "For what?" Malcolm asked, voice steady. The officer pulled open the door of Malcolm's car, reached inside, and lifted a small bag of white powder into the air. "Possession with intent to distribute," the officer said, shaking his head like he was disappointed. "Never figured you for a dealer, Reed." It was too clean, too perfect. They had set him up. As they wrenched his hands behind his back, locking the cuffs in place, Malcolm clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. This wasn't about taking him off the streets. This was about making sure he never came back. They dragged him toward a waiting patrol car. As he was shoved inside, he caught sight of a figure standing near the edge of the lot. Watching. Ethan Hayes. He didn't say a word, didn't step forward, and he didn't meet Malcolm's eyes. Malcolm sat on the hard metal bench, his back against the concrete wall, hands resting loosely in his lap. The holding cell smelled of sweat and old disinfectant, the air thick with the staleness of too many bodies crammed into too small a space. He had been in places like this before, on the other side of the bars. It felt different now. No phone call, no lawyer, no one even bothering to process him yet. That meant only one thing. They weren't planning on letting him go. He leaned his head back, listening to the distant hum of voices from beyond the bars. Officers chatting about their weekends like nothing unusual was happening. Like a man wasn't being framed just a few feet away from them. The heavy clank of the door unlocking pulled his attention forward. Dolan stepped inside, slow and deliberate, the way a man does when he already knows the outcome of a fight. He didn't wear his uniform jacket, just a pressed shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a badge gleaming at his belt. He carried himself like he owned the place, because, in a way, he did. He let the silence sit between them for a moment before speaking. "You really thought you could take me down?" Dolan's voice was smooth, almost amused. "That's cute." Malcolm didn't answer. Dolan stepped closer, hands in his pockets, tilting his head as he studied Malcolm like a scientist examining an insect. "I don't know what's worse. That you thought you had a chance, or that you were dumb enough to believe you'd get out of this alive." Malcolm kept his breathing steady. "I want my lawyer." Dolan laughed, a real, full-bodied laugh that echoed in the small space. "Yeah? And I want a world where people like you know their place. Guess we're both gonna be disappointed." He turned toward the door, pausing just before stepping out. "You won't be here long. Reed, just long enough for me to decide what happens next." The door slammed shut behind him. The sound heavy, final. Malcolm exhaled slowly. They wanted him to feel helpless. That's how they broke people. He wasn't going to break. Hours passed, maybe more. The clock on the wall had stopped working a long time ago. And there were no windows. No way to track time. Eventually, Carter showed up. The smirk was already on his face as he entered the cell. Arms crossed like he had been waiting for this moment. "Hope the accommodations are to your liking," Carter said, leaning against the bars. "Would have gotten you a nicer room. But, you know, budget cuts." Malcolm didn't move. Carter stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This can go one of two ways. Reed, you play along. Keep your mouth shut. Maybe this all goes away. You keep fighting?" He shrugged. "Well, accidents happen all the time in places like this." Malcolm stayed silent. Carter's smirk flickered, just for a second. Then, without warning, his fist lashed out, cracking against Malcolm's ribs. Malcolm gritted his teeth but didn't react. "See, that's the problem with guys like you," Carter muttered, shaking out his hand. "Always think you're tougher than the system." Another punch, this time to the gut. Malcolm absorbed the pain, keeping his breathing even. He had taken worse. Carter sighed, stepping back, shaking his head like he was disappointed. "I'll check in later. Maybe by then, you'll have figured out how things work around here." He turned to leave. Then he stopped. Ethan Hayes stood just outside the cell. For a second, Carter looked like he might say something. But then he just scoffed and walked out. Ethan hesitated before stepping closer. His face was blank, but there was tension in his jaw. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Malcolm studied him. "Do you care?" Ethan exhaled through his nose. "You should have walked away. You still can," Malcolm said. "But you won't, will you?" Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket. His movements subtle, practiced. His hand brushed against Malcolm's as he turned to leave. Something small and folded pressed into Malcolm's palm. Malcolm didn't look down until Ethan was gone. He unfolded the paper carefully, keeping it low. A single address. No name, no instructions, just a location. Malcolm's pulse steadied. He wasn't done yet. The metal cuffs dug into Malcolm's wrists as he sat in the back of the patrol car. His breath slow, steady. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. But panic wouldn't help. Thinking would. Carter was in the driver's seat, humming a tune under his breath like this was just another late-night drive. The man in the passenger seat was different. Unfamiliar. A thick-necked officer with a shaved head. His grip tight around the handle of a holstered gun. Malcolm knew how prisoner transport worked. There were procedures, protocols. Yet something about this wasn't right. No radio check-ins. No backup trailing them. And then there was the route. The highway should have taken them straight to the downtown detention center. But Carter took an exit that led toward the outskirts of the city. The roads grew emptier, the glow of streetlights becoming scarce. Malcolm tensed. This wasn't a transfer. This was an execution. Carter glanced at him in the rearview mirror, catching the realization in his eyes. He smirked. "Figured it out, huh?" Malcolm didn't answer. He shifted his weight slightly, testing the cuffs. Too tight. He needed another way. The other officer spoke for the first time. You can make this easy. Read, or you can make it messy. Carter chuckled. Either way, it ends the same. They drove deeper into the woods, the asphalt giving way to gravel. The car rocked slightly as they veered off the main road, heading down a narrow dirt path flanked by thick trees. No cameras, no witnesses. Malcolm forced himself to stay still. Timing was everything. Carter pulled the car to a stop. The other officer got out first, moving to the back door. Out, he ordered. Malcolm hesitated just enough to make it look real before stepping out. The air was cold, damp with the scent of pine and wet earth. Carter leaned against the hood of the car, pulling out a cigarette, lighting it with a slow flick of his lighter. Don't take this personal, Reed. He exhaled smoke, watching it curl in the dim light. We all got jobs to do. Malcolm's muscles coiled. Ready. The other officer reached for his gun. Then, from the distance, the roar of an engine. Bright headlights cut through the darkness, growing larger by the second. The sound of tires grinding against gravel. Carter's expression twisted from amusement to confusion. What the hell? The approaching car didn't slow down. Malcolm seized the moment. He swung his elbow back, catching the other officer in the ribs. The man stumbled, giving Malcolm just enough room to twist and ram his shoulder into him, sending them both to the ground. A gunshot rang out, Carter firing wildly as he turned. The vehicle skidded to a stop, dust and debris kicking up. The driver's door flew open. Ethan Hayes stepped out, gun drawn. For a second, no one moved. Then everything exploded at once. The blinding headlights cut through the darkness, casting long, jagged shadows across the dirt road. Dust swirled in the air as Ethan's car screeched to a halt, the engine growling like a warning. Carter turned sharply, his gun still raised. The officer beside him hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden interruption. That was all Malcolm needed. He surged forward, twisting his body with every ounce of momentum he had left. His shoulder slammed into Carter's ribs, sending them both crashing to the ground. The gun flew from Carter's grip, skidding across the dirt. Carter grunted in pain, but he wasn't down yet. He rolled, shoving Malcolm off just as the other officer reached for his weapon. A gunshot cracked through the night. The second officer jerked backward, his leg giving out as he collapsed onto the gravel, clutching his thigh. Ethan stood by his car, smoke curling from the barrel of his gun. Malcolm barely had time to register it before Carter was on him again. Fists flew, knuckles colliding with flesh. Carter was strong, but Malcolm fought with something else. Something deeper. Survival, justice, fury. He blocked a wild swing, countered with a hard elbow to Carter's ribs, then drove his knee up into the man's stomach. Carter stumbled, coughing, but his hand darted to his belt. A flash of silver. The knife came fast, a vicious arc toward Malcolm's ribs. He twisted, barely dodging the blade as it sliced through the air. Carter lunged again. Malcolm caught his wrist this time, twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground. With a quick, brutal movement, Malcolm swept Carter's legs out from under him, sending him crashing onto his back. Before Carter could recover, Malcolm was on top of him, yanking the cuffs from his own wrists and snapping them onto Carter's instead. For the first time that night, Carter looked afraid. Malcolm leaned in close, voice low. Looks like you finally get to see what it's like on the other side of the cuffs. Carter glared, his breathing ragged. You think this changes anything? Ethan stepped closer, keeping his gun trained on the wounded officer still writhing in pain. It's a start. The wind howled through the trees, the tension between the three men thick. Charged. Malcolm turned to Ethan, studying his face. You knew. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. Malcolm clenched his jaw. And you didn't stop it? I wasn't sure what side I was on, Ethan admitted. His voice was quiet, but steady. Not until now. A long silence stretched between them. Then Ethan exhaled sharply, glancing toward his car. We don't have time for this. I know where Dolan keeps his records. If you really want to bring him down, we need to move. Now. Malcolm looked down at Carter, then back at Ethan. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. The city lights faded behind them as Malcolm gripped the wheel. His eyes locked on the darkened road ahead. The warehouse was on the outskirts of town, nestled between abandoned factories and crumbling industrial lots. Exactly the kind of place where people hid things they never wanted found. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, glancing at the side mirror every few minutes. He hadn't said much since they left, and Malcolm wasn't sure if it was guilt, fear, or both weighing him down. "You sure about this place?" Malcolm asked, breaking the silence. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Dolan used it for years. Drugs, money, evidence. Anything he needed off the books. It went through here first. Malcolm nodded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Then let's hope it's still there." They pulled up outside a rusted chain-link fence, the gate slightly ajar. The warehouse itself loomed in the darkness, a hollowed-out husk of concrete and steel, its broken windows glinting under the moonlight. Malcolm killed the engine. "Stay sharp." They stepped out, their footsteps crunching against gravel. The air was thick with the scent of oil and damp wood. The kind of place where time had stopped long ago. Ethan led the way, moving quickly toward a side entrance. The door was locked, but a few hard kicks from Malcolm forced it open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and the lingering scent of old cigarette smoke. Stacks of wooden crates lined the walls, some covered with tarps, others open, revealing long-forgotten shipments of stolen goods. Ethan headed straight for the back, where a row of filing cabinets sat untouched. "It should be in here," he muttered, yanking one open. Malcolm scanned the room, his instincts prickling. Places like this had eyes. He moved to an old metal desk, rifling through papers, folders, anything that could tie Dolan to the corruption. Then he saw it, a thick black ledger, the edges worn from use. He flipped it open. Names, dates, transactions, and then photographs. They were clipped to pages, each one a frozen moment in time. Officers standing over bodies, evidence bags being swapped out, Dolan himself shaking hands with men Malcolm knew weren't cops. "This is it," Malcolm said, his pulse quickening. "This is everything." Ethan leaned over, eyes widening. "We need to get this out now." Malcolm pulled out his phone, snapping pictures, then started uploading them to a secured cloud drive. The process was slow, each image loading with agonizing delay. Then, the distant growl of engines. Ethan stiffened. "They're here." Malcolm glanced at his screen. 70% uploaded. Not fast enough. Headlights cut through the gaps in the warehouse walls, casting long shadows across the floor. Then came the sound of car doors slamming. Voices. They had minutes, maybe less. Ethan reached for his gun. "We have to move." Malcolm shoved the ledger into his jacket. Almost done. Then the front doors burst open. Dolan walked in first, his movements slow, deliberate. He didn't need to rush, he already had them trapped. Behind him, 2 officers followed, their hands resting on their holsters. Malcolm's phone vibrated in his hand. Upload complete. Dolan smiled. "Well, look at this." He pulled out his gun, raising it without hesitation, the barrel aimed straight at Malcolm's head. Malcolm could feel the weight of the gun aimed at his skull, the cold stare behind it even heavier. Dolan stood a few feet away, calm, confident, a man who had played this game too long to expect anything but victory. The warehouse smelled of rust and oil, the air thick with the promise of violence. "You've been a real pain in my ass, Reed," Dolan said, shaking his head. "You should have taken the hint. Should have walked away." Malcolm's fingers curled slightly, feeling the edge of the flash drive still tucked into his pocket. "You really think you can make this go away?" Dolan smirked. "I don't think. I know." The officers flanking him shifted, their hands steady on their weapons. The moment stretched, the kind of silence that only comes before a gunfight. Then Ethan moved. It was fast. Too fast for them to react. He lunged, grabbing the nearest officer and wrenching his arm back, forcing the man's gun toward the ground. A shot fired, echoing through the warehouse, and chaos erupted. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He dropped low, twisting to the side as Dolan's gun went off. A bullet whizzed past his ear, shattering a metal crate behind him. He rolled, coming up behind a stack of pallets, yanking his own gun free. Ethan and the officer struggled, fists flying. The second officer turned his aim toward them, but Malcolm fired first. The man dropped with a grunt, Clutching his leg, Dolan cursed, ducking behind cover. Kill them. Bullets tore through the warehouse. Sparks flew as rounds ricocheted off metal beams. Malcolm pressed himself against the crates, counting his shots. He had to end this fast. He peeked out, just in time to see Ethan take a hit. The bullet slammed into his side, and he staggered, his face twisting in pain. Malcolm's breath caught, but there was no time to think. Dolan was moving, circling, trying to get an angle. Malcolm shifted, rolling into the open. He fired, once, twice, forcing Dolan back. Ethan collapsed to one knee, blood spreading fast through his shirt. Finish it, he gasped. Malcolm's mind raced. The files, the evidence. His fingers flew over his phone, triggering the upload. The seconds dragged as the bar crept forward. Dolan saw him move. What the hell are you doing? Malcolm didn't answer. He just kept his back against the crates, watching the upload crawl toward 100%. Dolan stepped closer. Malcolm's heart pounded. Almost there. Then, sirens. Dolan froze. The sound cut through the night, growing louder, closing in fast. Red and blue lights flashed through the cracks in the warehouse walls. Dolan's expression shifted. Rage. Realization. You son of a. The doors burst open. Officers poured in, weapons raised. Malcolm exhaled, his body sagging against the crates. It was over. The Atlanta Police Department was in chaos. Phones rang off the hook. Reporters crowded outside, their cameras flashing like strobes against the storm that was unraveling inside. Officers whispered in tight clusters, eyes darting to the TV screens mounted on the walls. The news anchors weren't pulling any punches. The scandal rocking the Atlanta Police Department continues to unfold, with leaked documents exposing a vast web of corruption, cover-ups, and violent abuses of power. The reporter announced, her tone grave. The evidence implicates several high-ranking officials, including Lieutenant Frank Dolan, a man once considered untouchable. Inside his office, Dolan watched in silence, the color draining from his face. Turn it off, he snapped. No one moved. He slammed his fist against his desk. I said turn it off. A young officer rushed to comply. Fumbling with the remote, the screen went black, but the damage had already been done. Outside, the precinct was fracturing. Some officers were already packing up their desks, stuffing files into bags, erasing emails. Others sat frozen, waiting to see who would fall and who would survive. Dolan could see it in their faces. The shift. Loyalty was a currency, and his had just lost all value. He pushed back from his desk, breathing heavily. His mind raced. The system had always protected him before, shielding him like an iron fortress. But now the walls were crumbling. He needed to leave. His phone buzzed on his desk. Unknown number. He picked up. You need to move, the voice said. Now. Dolan didn't ask questions. He grabbed his coat and his gun, tucking them under his jacket before stepping into the hallway. Every eye was on him. He forced himself to smirk, as if this was just another day, just another crisis to maneuver through. But the moment he stepped outside, he knew the game had changed. The news vans were already lined up along the curb. Cameras swung toward him. Microphones stretched forward. Lieutenant Dolan, do you have a comment? Are the accusations true? How long has this corruption been going on? He ignored them, pushing through the crowd. A black sedan was waiting for him at the corner. He reached for the door handle. A voice stopped him. Dolan. Malcolm. Dolan turned, his smirk returning, though there was a flicker of something behind his eyes now. Something raw. You don't look so untouchable anymore, Malcolm said. Dolan tilted his head. You really think this is over? Malcolm took a step closer. No, but I think you are. A flash of movement. Dolan swung the door open. Diving inside, the tires screeched as the car sped off, weaving through traffic. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward an unmarked cruiser, yanking the door open. Ethan, still pale from his injuries but too stubborn to stay out of the fight, slid into the passenger seat. You up for this? Malcolm asked. Ethan winced as he adjusted his seatbelt. Do I have a choice? Malcolm gunned the engine. The chase was on. The streets blurred past in streaks of red and white as Dolan's car weaved through traffic. Trying to lose them, Malcolm kept his hands steady. His eyes locked on the tail lights ahead. Dolan took a sharp right, cutting through an intersection. A horn blared as a delivery truck skidded to a stop. Barely missing him, Malcolm followed, tires screeching. Up ahead, Dolan's car darted toward a government district. The buildings growing taller, the streets narrowing. Where the hell is he going? Ethan muttered. Then Malcolm saw it. The mayor's office. Dolan's car came to a screeching halt at the steps. He threw the door open, running full tilt toward the entrance. But Malcolm was faster. He tackled Dolan from behind, sending them both crashing onto the pavement. For a second, they struggled. Dolan clawed at Malcolm's grip, but the fight was gone from him. The sound of sirens filled the air. A pair of uniformed officers rushed forward, guns drawn. Malcolm yanked Dolan's arms behind his back, snapping the cuffs into place. It was over. Dolan panted, his face pressed against the cold concrete. Then, slowly, he chuckled. "You think you've won," he murmured. Malcolm frowned. "I don't think. I know." Dolan turned his head slightly, his eyes gleaming. "There will always be more like me. The system doesn't break this easily." Malcolm didn't respond. He didn't need to, as the officers hauled Dolan to his feet and dragged him toward the waiting patrol car. Malcolm exhaled, letting the weight of it all sink in. Maybe Dolan was right. Maybe the system wouldn't fall overnight. But tonight, one piece of it had. And that was enough. For now. The Atlanta Police Department felt different now. The usual air of quiet authority had been replaced by something uneasy. Something fragile. Officers moved through the hallways with careful steps, their voices hushed, their eyes flicking toward the doors of the Internal Affairs Office. No one knew who would still have a job tomorrow. Malcolm sat in a chair at the end of a long table, facing a panel of investigators. Some were from the department, some from the state attorney's office. Their expressions were unreadable, but he could feel the weight of their attention. "You understand the seriousness of your accusations?" one of them asked. Malcolm met his gaze without hesitation. "I do. Lieutenant Dolan and multiple officers under his command have been arrested." Another investigator said, "But the depth of this corruption runs further than we anticipated. Are you prepared to testify against anyone else implicated in these files?" Malcolm exhaled. He had known this moment was coming. Exposing Dolan had been the beginning, not the end. The system had protected men like him for decades, and cutting off one head wouldn't stop another from growing in its place. "If it means real change," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "Then yes." A murmur ran through the panel. Some nodded, some simply took notes. The lead investigator folded his hands. "We'll be in touch, Officer Reed. For now, you're on administrative leave until this is settled." Malcolm expected that. They had to make it look like the system was handling this cleanly, like everything was under control. But outside these walls, the truth was spreading faster than they could contain it. He stepped out of the building into the late afternoon sun. Across the street, a crowd had gathered, protesters holding signs, chanting for reform, justice for Atlanta, hold them accountable, end police corruption. The voices rang out, echoing off the surrounding buildings. Some people held signs with Dolan's face crossed out in red. Others carried banners demanding change. Not just in Atlanta, but everywhere. Malcolm watched for a long moment, the weight of everything settling over him. He had lit the spark. But this was bigger than him now. The system wasn't going to change overnight. But maybe, just maybe, it had started to crack. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. Malcolm found Ethan in a private room, his arm bandaged, his face pale but alert. "You look like hell," Ethan muttered. Malcolm smirked. "You should see the other guy." Ethan exhaled, his fingers tracing the edges of his blanket. "So, did we actually do it?" Malcolm leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Dolan's in custody. A lot of his guys are flipping to save themselves." Ethan shook his head. "And the ones who aren't?" Malcolm sighed. "They're still out there." Silence hung between them. Ethan looked out the window. "We won a battle," he said finally. "Not the war." Malcolm nodded. "Yeah, the system still had its shadows, its cracks where men like Dolan thrived. But now, those shadows weren't as safe as they used to be." As Malcolm left the hospital, he could hear the distant hum of the protests growing louder. Change was coming. The cafe was nearly empty. save for a few regulars scattered across the dimly lit space. The hum of conversation mixed with the clinking of cups and the distant murmur of a news broadcast playing on the TV mounted in the corner. Malcolm sat near the window, fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He wasn't drinking it, he was watching the rain smear across the glass, distorting the city beyond. His phone buzzed. Another headline. Police corruption scandal sparks nationwide investigation. Reforms on the table. But no immediate action taken. He exhaled through his nose. The exposure had rattled the system, but it hadn't broken it. Dolan was behind bars, but there were more like him. The machine kept running, the same faces in different uniforms. "Excuse me." Malcolm barely turned as someone slid into the seat across from him. A man in his late 40s, dressed in a worn leather jacket, hands resting on a brown folder. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. Malcolm glanced at him. "Do I know you?" The man shook his head. "Not yet." He pushed the folder forward. "You took down Dolan. That's impressive, but you barely scratched the surface." Malcolm frowned, but he didn't move. The man tapped the folder. "Everything in here is real. Names, transactions, connections. The people who protect men like Dolan. The ones who make sure the system never really changes." Malcolm hesitated, then slowly pulled the folder toward him. He flipped it open. Black and white photos, bank records, handwritten notes. Some names he recognized, others he didn't. But the pattern was clear. This wasn't just about one corrupt cop. This was something bigger. The man leaned forward, voice low. "You ready for what comes next?" Malcolm didn't answer right away. He stared down at the papers, the weight of them settling over him like a second skin. Then he closed the folder. Outside, the rain had stopped. Malcolm stood, tucking the folder under his arm. As he stepped outside, movement on the street caught his eye. A police cruiser, red and blue lights flashing. 2 officers had pulled over a young black man, hands on their holsters, body language tense. The kid looked confused, afraid, just like Malcolm had. Once, the scene played out like a ghost from the past, a loop repeating itself. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, because the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The system didn't change overnight. Corruption doesn't crumble with a single arrest. But every truth exposed, every fight against injustice, weakens the foundation of those who abuse their power. Malcolm's battle wasn't just his own. It was a reflection of a much bigger war. One that's still being fought on every street, in every city. So the question is, if you saw injustice unfolding right in front of you, would you have the courage to stand up? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Covert Truths for more stories that reveal what's really happening beneath the surface. The truth is out there. Are you ready to face it?